Jonathan, can you see a good view of Mrs. Stevens?
He's not saying nothing. He's not saying nothing.
You still haven't quite found the camera, have you, Jodie? But never mind.
I better.
Yeah, somewhere around there. Yeah, that's good. We are recording, so all ready to go.
Right, everyone, there goes 10:30. Welcome to the next session of our trot through the Plantagenets. I'm going to send you a note about the dates in May shortly. I will also send you details about a podcast which focuses on the Plantagenets, and it really is a compelling listen that will add nicely to, if not the images of the Plantagenets, to the fascinating story about the way they performed. So over to you, Judy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for your loyalty. I hope you're all staying well. The reign of Henry II. You probably did do quite well. I'm assuming that you did something about Henry II at school, but probably you did the conflict with Becket, because that is really very, very a kind of juicy piece of royal scandal in a way. It's a very dramatic story, but that's going to happen next time because it's so dramatic that we really need to devote a whole session to it. That and its consequences, of course. But the murder in the cathedral, I think most people do know about that. And that may be the only incident that you dealt with at school. Well, I'm speaking personally. I can't remember doing anything much more about Henry II, except his conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury, which ended up with the poor Archbishop being murdered in his own cathedral, which was European news. You know, it was a complete scandal, a dreadful thing to have happened. Absolutely hit the headlines across Europe, the whole of Christendom and beyond. Even the Muslims were horrified at what had happened, that somebody could be murdered in their own cathedral on the orders of an erstwhile friend. So we're not doing that. We're doing that next time. So this is, in a way, leading up to that, because that was an absolutely crucial incident. So, Henry II, born in 1133 at Le Mans, that we know about in another way, and he got three nicknames: Henry Curtmantle, which means short cloak or short cape. Well, it suggests that he wore a cape rather than a cloak, which was fitting because his character was, he was always in a hurry, he was always quick, impatient, not exactly impetuous, but very impatient, wanted to get on with things. A long cloak presumably would have impeded him when he was leaping onto a horse or rushing from one room to another. So that became a nickname, Curtmantle, short cloak. Fitz, Empress. Fitz is the French fils, which means son of. So son of the Empress Matilda. And Plantagenet, which I think I mentioned last time, Planta genista, which is the broom plant, which is like gorse without its prickles, yellow flower, yellow shrub. Well, a shrub with yellow flowers. And that was their emblem. All families and all fighting men had some kind of an emblem. Most people couldn't read and write, so they used symbols instead of words, which is how heraldry came to be. So the Plantagenets had chosen this yellow broom because it's very weather resistant and grows in very poor soils, and sort of represented stability and courage and resistance and all sorts of these fine qualities which they reckon they've got or hope to have. So all these nicknames, all these names, not nicknames exactly, but other titles. And he was very fortunate in that he spent his life, his early years, being brought up in his mother's household, and unusually, she believed very strongly in education. So from the age of 7, he lived in Anjou, and he had an excellent tutor, a great educator, Peter of Saintes. Then, when he was 9, he came to England and lived in Bristol with relatives, had a very intensive education, and this is really unusual for a boy of his class. Normally, they were just trained to be knights. As soon as they could sit up, they were plonked onto a pony or a mule. They were taught how to ride and how to throw a spear, how to use a sword. They were trained as warriors. They were trained as soldiers, a very, very intensive training. But Henry was very lucky that he actually had a proper academic education combined with learning how to be a fine soldier, a fine warrior. Wherever he went, his mother arranged for a top tutor to tutor her son. And he ended up being able to speak Latin, which was lingua franca for the whole of Christendom. Obviously, church services were in Latin. Legal documents were in Latin. And it was very important to know how to speak Latin, but not for warriors. They were illiterate. They didn't speak Latin. He did. That made it very unusual. Even if he'd not become King of England, that would have marked him out. It was said that he could speak and understand several European languages, but weirdly, he didn't learn English. He didn't need to learn English. You know, he didn't know at that stage he was ever going to become King of England. But he had a wide education: astronomy, geography, theology. He thought that he had done history. I didn't write that down, but because I was trying to check it out. It was ancient history, what we call classical history, Greeks and Romans. There wasn't really any other kind at that particular time, Greeks and Romans. So when he rode out on campaign, it was commented upon that he had books in his saddlebag or in his entourage were carrying in the baggage train. He had books, but usually he had books, accessible books. He had books sort of with him with it. You know, he was riding, and in his saddlebag he got books as well as food, provisions, and weapons. Well, that was really considered quite weird in those days. It can't make sense, Rick, to have books. What on earth did he need books for? So it was commented upon as very unusual. So he was respected, but seen as not quite like other people. He was spotted quite young as being different. We don't know whether they thought it was in a good way or in a weird way, but he was spotted as being a bit special. What did he look like? Well, everybody commented on how unusual his looks were. He was short. He was but very solidly built, not overweight, just sturdy, strong looking, red hair, grey eyes, and the chroniclers commented that when he was angry, which was very often, his eyes went red and bloodshot, which suggested he got very high blood pressure. They didn't know about it in those days, but they certainly noticed his eyes that went red with anger. And that was interesting from the medical point of view, but also red eyes were connected with, well, certainly in Eastern Europe, with people who went around biting people's necks and sucking blood. It seemed as a sign that you were a vampire. So interesting that they all recorded this, that his eyes went bloodshot when he was angry. So that was sort of connection, somehow connected with the devil. The devil, with Satan, was usually shown with red eyes, and often with the red tail and red tipped claws. So yeah, there was something sort of rather dramatic about Henry when he was young. Closely freckled face, often that does go with red hair, ginger hair. So he was a ginge, and he kept his hair cut short, which again was quite unusual. And people said he looked like a lion. And he certainly had a temper to fit that description. So not a bad thing that as a young man, even as a teenager, he was making an impression. People were quite impressed by his looks. He looked like somebody to be reckoned with. And in personality and in character, massive amount of energy, huge energy, and a terrible temper. A terrible temper. The chroniclers noted later, and admittedly by then he was King of England, that he spent so much time riding that his legs had become bowed. That he was more often in the saddle than on foot. Because not because he was going to war all the time, but because he loved hunting and hawking and riding for the sake of it. He just loved riding. So it had actually damaged him physically. He got a very harsh, rough voice because he shouted a lot. He shouted orders, he lost his temper and shouted, and as a result, he got a hoarse voice. Another interesting aspect of him, even after he became very important, he became king, he didn't like luxurious clothes. He didn't like wearing robes. He didn't like dressing up for an occasion. He despised fine clothes. He thought that they were a waste of time, waste of money, foppish, and he was very masculine. He didn't like dressing up at all. So that was seen as slightly, well, unusual, a bit eccentric, but certainly once he was king, that he didn't like the trappings of monarchy. They accepted that he was very intelligent, interested in languages, and particularly in the law. And the main thing that they commented on was his horrible temper, that he lost his temper very quickly if things weren't done according to plan, or if people kept him waiting. Very impatient, got very angry very quickly. And one chronicler, now this has never really been accepted as true, because how could you find out so many 900 years later? One chronicler said, and he wasn't a favourable chronicler when he was writing about the king. He wasn't being even-handed. He wasn't unbiased. He said that the king would throw himself on the floor in a rage and chew the rushes. A lot of people thinking, well, what on earth does that mean? What rushes? What were they doing on the floor? Well, I'm sure you know this anyway, but I'll just go through it in case anybody doesn't know. Long ago, carpets and rugs were available from the Middle East and the Far East. They cost an arm and a leg, but they were available. But they were so expensive by the time they reached our part of Europe. We lived on the edge of Europe, so by the time they reached us, they were so expensive that people would never dream of putting them on the floor. They hung them on the walls and used them like tapestries. So there were beautiful Afghan rugs, Chinese rugs, Indian, Persian rugs, etc., and carpets, but they were on the wall. So what did they put on the floor? Hay, rushes, scattered with lavender and other sweet-smelling herbs. So when that was first done, that would be all right. That would smell quite nice as people walked about, and they would crush the lavender, using that as an example. It would smell quite nice. But I'm sure you know this. Our ancestors knew nothing about germs or viruses or bacteria or infections, and they didn't have flushing loos. They had hunting dogs, which were not pets, but they did have them indoors in case somebody stole them or poisoned them, or in case the dogs got ill by being outside. They did have kennels, but they often did have the hunting dogs inside. They weren't trained, they weren't house trained at all, so they just sort of weed and pooed all over the place. When people had meals in those days, they dropped quite a lot of food, apparently. They actually did just abandon food. They didn't leave it on their plates, they just dropped it on the floor in among the rushes, the straw, the hay. So after a few weeks, this nice smelling floor was beginning to smell absolutely horrible. And I'm explaining how come there were rushes on the floor. Presumably the king didn't sort of fall on the floor and start chewing rushes when it was all disgusting and dirty. But that's why this chronicler said that he fell on the floor like an angry toddler having a tantrum and chewed the rushes. But while I'm on the subject of the dirt that developed in castles in those days and palaces, this is one of the reasons that why medieval kings moved around so often, and why rich people had more than one home and still do. Why they kept moving around on a kind of circuit was to get to what they had to, because their houses or their palaces or their castles became so dirty, so smelly and so horrible that they had to move out. And then they would have what we call a deep clean, where these disgusting smelly rushes would be all scooped up, like cleaning out a huge rabbit hutch. Clean it all out, spread some more rushes or hay, sweet smelling hay on the ground, and put some more lavender down, etc., or spices if they could get hold of them. Again, incredibly expensive because they came from far away. No flushing loos until Queen Elizabeth's reign. The first, what we might call modern loo, was invented by her godson, John Hartington, in Elizabeth's reign, with levers and things. Before that, as you know, they were just latrines. If you've been shown around the castle, you've probably been shown, called garderobe. They had the idea that if you hung your clothes up above the latrine, which was open, so the smell came up, it would kill moths.
Oh.
So a wardrobe means a guard your robes, wardrobe, and the wardrobe was hidden above the loo, which was just an open hole with a cesspit at the bottom. I know it's a horrible subject, but it's interesting that that's where they hung the clothes deliberately, so that the smell would kill moths, which were a hazard in those days, sort of munching through expensive clothes. So this is back to the king chewing the rushes. It was a sign that he was a bit mad and a bit sort of to be avoided when he was in one of these moods, when he was in a furious rage. And the family legend was, fascinatingly, that the Anjou family were descended from Melusine. And the legend of Melusine was that she's very beautiful and she'd married young, but her husband noticed that she never went to mass. Everybody went to mass in those days. Obviously, everybody went. There wasn't anything else. There wasn't any other form of Christianity in Western Europe. You were Catholic, went to mass, and she didn't. The husband noticed. Why did she leave the church before the presentation, before the actual, the main point of the mass? Why did she leave? And he watched her carefully, and then to confirm his suspicions, he got some of his entourage to hold her in place so that she couldn't escape. And rather than actually see the host, the bread and the wine, she managed to escape, making a very weird hissing noise, and then flew out of the church, suddenly became airborne, which meant that she wasn't an ordinary human being. She was, in fact, Satan's daughter. But she had given birth to children, and the Anjou family were descended from her. That was the family legend, which they seemed quite proud of. You know, they weren't saying this is fake news, like Donald Trump, this is awful, this is fake news, how dare they say such a wicked thing. You know, we're taking you to court for defamation of character. They quite revelled in this idea that don't get on the wrong side of the Angevins because they're descended from Satan himself. It will be the worst for you. Don't mess with the Angevins. So the legend is that Melusine flew out of the church, and behind her, when she left, there was a fire and a horrible smell of sulphur, which was a sure sign that the devil was around. This smell of sulphur was a giveaway. So Henry of Anjou had inherited the terrible family temper. And instead of trying to control it, it was actually something he used to control other people. You know, please don't annoy him, don't upset him. Go with the flow, do whatever he wants, otherwise he might start throwing himself down and biting the rushes and totally losing it like a very, very angry toddler. Now, it could have been a terrible sort of negative thing that he lost control, but in fact he made it into an advantage. He made it into a kind of gift he'd got of controlling people using this violent temper. People sort of galloped, you know, rushed about doing what he wanted them to do. He could be charming. He could be very sociable. He had a sense of humour. He could make people laugh. He laughed with other people. But unlike Stephen, who of course had gone far too far in that direction, been far too matey with everybody, Henry of Anjou carried respect, even as a teenager. The 14-year-old people respected him, a bit wary of him, partly because of this awful temper he'd got, this rage. He didn't need to summon it up. He seemed to be quite near the surface. And at the age of 14, he was trusted with an army, a small army, which is incredible, even in those days when there wasn't a sort of school leaving age or a coming of age. But 14 was significant. You may remember, you probably remember this from school. The training to be a warrior was in 3 stages. If you came from a rich family, from at the age of 7 you became a page. Pardon me. At the age of 7 you were sent away to somebody else's castle or stately home to become a page, learn your manners, serve at table, learn to be humble and courteous, but also carry on with your training, sort of sitting a horse correctly and controlling a horse and learning to use spear, sword, etc., weapons. Then if you were a good page, at the age of 14, you were promoted to be a squire, which meant you could accompany a knight into battle. You could stand with the spare horse in case his horse got injured. You had to rush into the middle of the battle, provide another horse for your master, and continue with your training. But you didn't have to wait at table anymore. You stood behind your master at the table. You could go on errands, but you didn't have to actually serve at table. That was for page boys. Then if you were a good squire, at the age of 21, you were knighted, and that's why that was the coming of age. That's until recently, that was coming of age for people in this country. 21 for girls and boys, they became adults, because that's the age that you were knighted. That's when they believed boys finished growing, reached their full manly strength. It isn't quite accurate, but that's why they chose 21. But 14, interestingly, was not only you could become a squire, they used to sort of test boys out if they could draw, if they weren't of the knightly class, if they were like most of our ancestors, if you could draw a bow, and later it was a long bow, which was much harder to draw, needed huge strength. So there wasn't it wasn't quite as organized as I'm saying, 7, 14, 21. Because if a boy was very well grown and very strong or tall for his age, they would promote, he could advance, he could sort of skip a few years. And there were boys as young as 14 in the grown-up army. If they were tall and they could draw a bow, then they'd be in the army as infantrymen, as archers. And the same actually worked for boys of the knightly class. They could be sort of fast forwarded, and they could be made knights if they fought, if they did something fantastic in battle, like rush into the middle of a battle with the spare horse, or rescue their master if he was surrounded, if he was beleaguered, or being beleaguered, and then the squire sort of rushed in and rescued him. Nowadays he'd get a medal. In those days he was possibly knighted on the field of battle. So there were exceptions. There were younger men, much younger, teenagers, that had been knighted because they'd done something exceptional. So Henry was given command of a small army at the age of 14, not because he was tall, but because he was strong and respected. Now, the next thing that you may have done at school, and if not, you've probably seen the film of the Lion in Winter, is marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, this is very interesting, sort of real royal gossip. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a fantastically rich heiress, owned vast, in her own right, had inherited vast chunks of France. And she'd been married, an arranged marriage, of course. All marriages for rich people were arranged in those days. The couple didn't usually have much say in the matter at all. She'd been married when she was very young to King Louis of France. And they had very little in common. She had 2 daughters, but no son. And obviously, in those days, the principal reason for marriage was to produce male children in order to inherit an heir and a spare. We've got that very much in our minds at the moment, but you needed more than one spare in those days because of because there weren't cures for many illnesses in those days, so you needed several sons. She hadn't got any at all. She was very self-willed, very independent of spirit, and she found her husband mega boring. He loved her very much. She didn't love him at all, it seems. And he was dull, didn't have much conversation. She had been brought up, she was very spirited anyway, but she'd been brought up in a court with many, many opportunities for learning. She was very intelligent. She knew a lot. Louis didn't. He was just dull and pedestrian and boring and tame. And their love life apparently wasn't up to much, because she once said, she shouldn't have said it, but she did, that it's like being married to a monk. I mean, that's the sort of woman she was. She spoke her mind. Women weren't supposed to have any opinions about anything in those days. So that was very alarming, that she'd actually derided her husband in that way, which is why the chronicler had reported it. It's either popping out on stalks, I should think, that a woman would dare to say such a thing, sort of maligning her husband's potency, like being married to a monk. What she was doing, she was defending herself, and somebody said, why have you only got 2 daughters? She was saying it was his fault, which was unheard of in those days. So everybody knew that the marriage wasn't very happy, or certainly she wasn't very happy. And she met Henry of Anjou when he was only 18. She was 11 years older. And they just fell for each other. And she very openly decided that he was the man for her, even though he was only 18, he was still a teenager. That he was everything her husband wasn't. He was exciting and vibrant, and he got a powerful personality, and he was intelligent and educated and virile. And so this sort of romance developed very, very quickly. And there was the issue of her only having given her husband two daughters. So the King of France wrote to the Pope and said, please, can I have an annulment? There was no such thing as divorce. I should probably remember from Henry VIII. An annulment of the marriage, not a divorce. But you had to have good grounds, obviously. You got to prove that the marriage was illegal from the word go, that it should never have happened, that you cancelled the Pope would cancel the marriage as if it had never happened, and then you were free to marry again. Well, marry for the first time. The first marriage having been totally cancelled. And eventually, Louis was able to persuade the Pope to grant an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity. This was a very convenient way of annulling marriages, that they would look through the family tree and find that there was a distant relationship. You think, well, why didn't they notice that before, when they went into, arranged marriages were legal. People beforehand did a lot of investigating to sort of match the couple up. It was a bit like computer dating. Why hadn't anybody spotted this before? Well, they either hadn't or they had, and it didn't matter. But anyway, now this is a very convenient way of legally ending the marriage. And so at a stroke, Henry of Anjou inherited vast swathes of France. He held the land, or she held the land, because of the feudal system. But suddenly he became a really important player in terms of European politics. He owned or held more French territory than the French king himself. And initially the marriage was very happy. They both got what they wanted. He got this enormous amount of, suddenly, because of the law in those days, women on marriage gave all their goods and chattels and belongings to their husband. Well, they didn't give it, but the husband had the right to take it. So that pleased him no end much. He'd got a very vibrant wife, and she got what she wanted. She got a nice virile husband. And she ended up giving him 8 children, even though she was 11 years older. 8 children, which does make you wonder about Louis of France. 5 sons, so the succession was safe. There was a spare and a spare and a spare and a spare and a spare. Serially unfaithful, but that wasn't an issue to begin with. That just made him seem more exciting, that he wasn't faithful to her. It didn't damage the relationship. And Martin's found this interesting sort of family tree, which looks a bit like an octopus, with the children: William, young Henry, who was the heir but died young, Richard, became Richard I, Matilda, Geoffrey, Eleanor, Joan, and John, who became King John. So she had certainly done her duty as far as supplying heirs to the English throne. So when King Stephen died, if you remember, to end the civil war, this agreement had been made that when Stephen died, Empress Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, should become the new King of England. He was only 21 years old. But although he was only 21, he'd had years of experience. I say he'd had experience since he was 14 of commanding the army. And he was, say, intelligent and well educated, and nobody said, oh, he's too young to be king, or let's take advantage of him. He had this presence, this sort of personality. Nobody thought they were going to take advantage of him. And he moved in on the terrible problems that he inherited in England following 19 years of what was called the anarchy, 19 years of misrule. So very, very quickly, because that was his nature, get on with it. Don't spend a long time discussing things and talking about what you're going to do, just get on and do it. which is what was needed. Somebody dynamic that was going to deal with the awful problems. They'd been our ancestors were longing for somebody strong and effective to take over, because things were going to rack and ruin because of the chaos caused by the Civil War. So, first of all, and these illegal castles have been popping up like mushrooms all over the country. And awful things had been happening in these castles, torture, all sorts of things, people being starved to death, hung up by their hands until they died. Just not all of them, obviously, but some terrible things had happened because these castles were unlicensed, illegal, and just a sign that the barons had taken over command, really, from the king. So he demanded that these castles be dismantled, actually taken down, sort of effectively bulldozed. And so some of the barons didn't believe that he meant it until the castle started to disappear, literally disappear, and the stone carted off and used for something more effective somewhere else. Oh, yes, he does mean it. He insisted on baronial obedience to the crown, so to take their oaths again, take their oaths of loyalty. And if they didn't do as they were told, oh, their land disappeared. In the reign of Stephen, they seem to have forgotten, because the king hadn't used his power in that way, that the barons didn't own land, they held it from the king. And his loyalty was punished by, oh, suddenly, oh, my land has disappeared. Oh, you know, we've got somebody really powerful in charge. He means what he says. He doesn't just say he's going to do things, he actually does them. So in a very short time, though he was only in his 20s, he had command, and he achieved respect, unlike poor King Stephen, who everybody liked, but nobody really respected. And law and order was a big problem. First of all, there were differences dating back to the Danelaw and the Norman Conquest. So the north of England, law in the north of England was different from law in the south of England because of the Danelaw. The system introduced by Henry I had broken down due to prolonged civil war. The system he created of travelling judges holding assize courts. The barons and the top men had taken matters into their own hands and used the civil war to their own advantage. And they'd invented some new and horrible punishments for quite minor infringements of the law, and what we later became known as kangaroo courts. You know, a bit like the Wild West, where people had invented their own form of justice, or no justice at all, just sort of hanging people off from a tree, you know, deciding on this, not spur of the moment exactly, but making up their own rules, not going through the courts at all, which means total breakdown of law and order. And that is what had been happening during these 19 years. In certain areas, law and order had broken down. The barons and the rich people were capturing people and holding them for ransom, kidnapping people, just breaking into people's property and taking everything they owned to get their own back, to revenging themselves on an enemy. Obviously, this had to be dealt with. So the king moved very quickly and very effectively because he had studied the law. This is where his good education came into play. He knew, he wasn't a planner. He wasn't somebody who sat and sort of thought things through and wrote a book about it or wrote lots of notes. It all seemed to be in his head. But he had obviously been thinking what needed to be done. So he created judges who would travel the country and judge the cases of people accused of breaking the law. So effectively, all crimes were judged by the king or his appointed judges, not by the local people who might be biased or influenced, because that was another problem that the local people had been saying, oh, well, round here, we do it this way. You know, we've got our own way of doing things. Because no, you haven't. We have uniformity. Everybody does the same, otherwise it's not, obviously justice is not justice. If it varies, it's a bit like the United States, where different states have got their own laws. And that often doesn't seem fair. So in this country, because it's a small united country, the king's able to say, no, you do it my way, otherwise it's illegal. There must be conformity. Judges were given royal authority to collect fines. Now this was a good move. The monarchs were always short of money. This is a good way of getting money. Fines, punishments, okay. Fines. Back to the Saxon idea that it's better to ask people for money rather than chopping their fingers off or chopping their hands off. Money. Fines for petty crimes. Petty, of course, comes from the petit, small in French, small crimes, the kind that now are judged in a magistrate's court. His great invention or great introduction was trial by jury. The Saxons had something similar, but now trial by jury was introduced as a standard. A number of local men, not women, usually 12 to represent the 12 apostles, would judge the case of someone accused of a crime. It wasn't just left to one person who might be biased or a bit stupid or impatient and in a hurry and not listening to the evidence properly. 12 people who would listen to the evidence and hopefully agree on innocent or guilty. Safer with 12 rather than it being in the hands of one person. And this replaced trial by ordeal, which was a Norman idea that God would decide, which is all very well, trial by ordeal. All that was left afterwards was trying witches. They were tried by ordeal. You probably remember one of the ways of testing for a witch was to truss a woman up like a chicken and then throw her into deep water. If she floated, she was guilty. She was a witch because Satan had made her float. It wasn't natural for a heavy body to float. A heavy body should sink. So I've always thought that was the wrong way around, because if you nearly drowned, you were innocent. So hopefully they would fish you out really quickly. If you were innocent and you're all trussed up, you couldn't swim. So they did have long poles with hooks on, ready to hook the lady out of the water before she actually drowned, because that doesn't seem right at all. I always thought it should be the other way around. If you sank, you were guilty, and if you floated, God was helping you, saving your life. Except they threw you in upside down, so you'd be sort of face down. But that was a kind of trial by ordeal. God decided. But the king wanted that replaced by trial by jury. Thoughtfulness, not leaving it all to God, supposing, well, that often didn't work. Trial by ordeal was very risky when a lot of people, innocent people, were probably found guilty, and the other way around. And in 1215, the great Pope Innocent III actually forbade priests to oversee ordeals, and trial by jury became the standard way of determining guilt or innocence. 1176, the king introduced a general air, which was, well, rather like an Ofsted inspection, to check that everything was in order and that people were obeying the rules and following his orders, and that there was conformity, uniformity. Royal judges had to go around all the counties in England to cover civil and criminal cases and check that all was well. There was no bribery, corruption, carelessness, leaving cases unheard. The king would have been horrified now if he came alive again today and saw what delays there were in our justice system. He would say that's not justice. Having to wait so long for a verdict is not justice. People are being kept in remand or even let out on bail. The case should be heard quickly. Well, that worked in medieval times. It certainly doesn't work now. There's a massive backlog, as we know. 1166, the famous Assize of Clarendon, the Clarendon Code, new assize courts dealing specifically with, these are civil cases, of course, dispossession of land, inheritance rights, and the rights of widows. So gradually, what was happening was that our modern justice system was being developed. Different courts for different issues, and very heavy emphasis on true justice. The king had been trained in law, and he was very concerned about the situation he inherited. So that was something excellent that he introduced. And if for no other reason, he should be remembered and thanked for the effective and efficient way in which he brought justice back to this country, and better justice even than before. The economy and finance. Now, all medieval kings were very concerned about money. The money belonged to the king, the royal treasury. Basically, it belonged to the king. There was no parliament at this stage. So taxes were paid directly to the king, or in effect, the money went to the king and was put in the royal treasury, and it was cash. There wasn't any, it was very basic. So the system had broken down during the anarchy, as many other systems had broken down. Taxes had either not been collected, because there was fighting going on in the area, or somebody had collected the taxes and then legged it, sort of taken the money and disappeared with the money. All sorts of corrupt systems had developed, people just taking advantage of the situation. So there had to be urgent reform regarding collection and delivery of tax money. So first of all, 1158, the coinage was rejigged, and the king had his name put on the coins, and reduced the number of moneyers so that he had control over coin production. There were too many mints, there were too many people producing money without authority. He dealt with that. New taxes introduced, unpopular of course, plus a re-audit of existing accounts. So the king was red hot on this, red hot, and was really, really good at sorting out his finances. And so the new legal system, introducing more fines instead of physical punishments or just hanging somebody off a tree, brought in more revenue. A new coin, a new silver penny called the short cross. And you can see, Martin's found a lovely picture. Before that, and after actually, they reintroduced the long cross, which went to the edge of the coin. This is a new coin, and it had the right amount of silver in it. And I mean, another thing that I'm sure you know about was that silver being very soft, you can sort of nibble bits off the silver. Clipping is called. You just sort of go around the edges, clipping, like cutting nails. And silver coins being soft, if you use strong enough clippers, you can steal quite a lot of silver. And if you collect coins, and I've got a King John penny, which is about half the size of what it should look like. Somebody has had a go at it. And this continued, even though they put an edge on it, so you can see where the edge should be, and they put a name around it so that you can see if it's been clipped. People went on clipping coins until in the 17th century, somebody had the bright idea of putting a milled edge around the coin. So you could see if it had been, part of the silver had been taken, because of course it lost its value. I mean, our coins are nickel, they haven't got any silver in them, but for hundreds of years, the silver coin represented that value in silver. So if it had been clipped, it wasn't worth that much anymore, and it was causing inflation and all sorts of problems. So there were they often redesign coins trying to avoid this problem of clipping. But even though people could see that it had been clipped, they had no alternative. Somebody gave them change and they found they got coins that were sort of smaller than they should be. Just tough luck. They hadn't got any alternative. Well, they could say, I'm not accepting this. And the shopkeeper would say, well, sorry, they've all been clipped. They're all smaller than they should be. But that made everything more expensive, because people would then put the shopkeepers would then put the price up, so they weren't given low value silver coins. So constant efforts in medieval times to get the coinage right and to reduce the number of people making coins, because sometimes they were debasing the silver, putting something else in so that it didn't have the right value. So there are all sorts of ways, I can't remember all the different ways of sort of dipping silver into certain liquids and they change colour, or testing to see if it was genuine. So Henry II sorted that out. Foreign relationships were very, very effective, again, because he had he gained such respect. He dealt very effectively with threats to his landholdings in France, in Wales, in Scotland, and in Ireland. Remember, it was just England in those days. The Scots had their own, they were a separate country with their own royal family, their own laws, etc. Wales, very well, if you're Welsh, you wouldn't say Wales was troublesome. You would say the Welsh were fighting for their independence. They kept nearly gaining independence, and then an invasion and failing right through the Middle Ages. Wales was what you could describe as turbulent. Obviously, there are Welsh nationalists today who believe that Wales should be a separate country with its own. It's got it, I suppose, sort of its own government now with devolution, but Wales has never really. Many Welsh people never accepted that they are part of the United Kingdom. Wales is totally different. It was a Celtic country with its own culture, its own history, of which they were very proud. So this went right through the Middle Ages, really, right through to well, certainly as far as Elizabeth's reign, the Welsh wanted their independence. Ireland even more so. The Normans had built castles in Ireland. They were trying to subdue the Irish. So it's hard for us to realise that England meant literally just England, a little country, not the United Kingdom. But he dealt very effectively with trouble in Scotland, trouble in Wales, and trouble in Ireland. The Angevin Empire was huge. It stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The king didn't. Now I've just realised I've taken my bookmark out, which is a rather daft thing to do. Bear with me. On the right page. Yeah, here we are. Right. If I read out a list of where Henry II kept his Christmas court. Christmas court in those days was very important. Where did the king spend his Christmas? Because he didn't just celebrate Christmas, he listened to people's demands. He dealt with justice, that something that hadn't been settled properly. It was a very, very important occasion, Christmas, because the king was settled in one place, certainly for a few days, and all sorts of government business was dealt with. So 1154, Bermondsey. 1155, Westminster. 1156, Bordeaux. 1157, Lincoln. 1158, Cherbourg. 1159, Falaise. 1160, Le Mans. 1161, Bayeux. 1162, Cherbourg. 1163, back in England, Berkhamsted. 1164, Marlborough. 1165, Woodstock. And then 1166, Poitiers. 1167, Argentan. 1168, Argentan. 1169, Nantes. 1170, Bure. Not sure how you say that. 1172, Dublin. 1171, sorry, Dublin. 1172, Chinon. 1172, Caen. 1174, Argentan. 1175, Windsor. 1176, Nottingham. 1177, Angers. 1178, Winchester. 1179, Nottingham. 1180, Le Mans. 1181, Winchester again. 1182, Caen. 1185, Le Mans. 1184, Windsor. 1185, Domfront. 1186, Guildford. 1187, Caen. And 1188, Saumur. Sort of worked that out mathematically. Spent an awful lot of time in France, with different French territories, and only 13 years scattered, 13 years in this country, which shows really where his priorities lay. He was King of England. He was also king of a large chunk of France, and he spent a lot of time being peripatetic, as we said they were anyway, which is why he very rarely spent the same. When he was in England, he didn't spend Christmas in the same place. He didn't go to Windsor, or, well, he could have gone to Balmoral, but didn't have the same routine as our royal family. So constantly on the move, partly for reasons of hygiene, but not only for that reason, keeping an eye on his scattered, far-flung territories that he was now definitely in command. I'm just going to read this to end. There were higher characters and greater politicians than Henry II among his contemporaries. For example, Innocent III, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and the French Philip Augustus. And there have been better rulers of England, but none of more individual genius, and few to whom the nation owes such a lasting debt. The impression which he made on those who served or loved or hated him was so vivid that after 700 years his figure still stands outlined against an angry sky. That stocky, bandy-legged figure with lion face, bloodshot grey eyes, and cropped reddish-grey hair, never seated a minute, hating ceremony, careless of time and meals and comfort, was the might and passion of the flesh rather than a lofty mind or fine spirit. So that's a very interesting summary, although it's actually the beginning of the chapter on Henry II. And I'll just read a little bit more. But though these strains wrecked his peace and his kingdom, he was a great ruler, alert and decisive, thrifty in managing his estates, tireless in the saddle and in council, genial in negotiation, a judge of men, as loyal to his servants as unrelenting to his foes. Hawks and hounds, his real passion, moved with his ever-moving court, and the forest law was his one severity. But he was neither irreligious nor unintellectual. He would talk or scribble during mass, but chose administrator bishops of decent character and befriended the saintly Hugh of Lincoln, who later became a saint. His mind was always working, although he took more pleasure in conversation than in books. For administration, he had both a taste and a genius. Never losing sight of main principles, he perpetually experimented in detail and was himself well skilled in criticizing a charter or drafting a clause. With rare exceptions, he was merciful and magnanimous. A sort of politic restraint supplying the place of justice kept him from aggression abroad or tyranny at home. And since action itself was what he lived for, he preferred the next or the best possible step to fine-spun theory or deep design. So a very balanced judgment of one of our early medieval kings. But next time we look at the big issue of his clash with the church and the death of Becket, which was absolutely crucial in judging Henry II's reign or judging him as a king. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Stay well.
Thank you, Judy. The next time we shall meet then will be on the 8th of May. And I'll send a note out to confirm that. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Bye.
That was
Thank
brilliant.
you.